Fantastic. This is Jennifer again from Agi Next in our continued experimentation on Facebook Live, bringing the community to you no matter where you are. And today we're sitting down with Jenny Martin. How are you, Jenny?
I'm good, thank you, Jennifer.
And please tell me a bit about yourself.
I guess I've been working in tech for about 20, nearly 25 years. Recently I've moved a bit more over to the people side. So I guess I started out doing psychology, spent 20 years apologising for that in IT. And now all of a sudden people and IT are coming much closer together. So I guess my zone has been about collaboration in technical teams is what I've been focusing on the last sort of 5 years or so.
What do you think made a transition? Do you think it was a transition just that you chose to make from tech to culture, or do you think that's just reflective of the industry, or both?
So I think I always felt most in the zone when I was working as part of a team and we were all aligned in getting things done. And I think that so that's why I've been really interested in the more collaborative approaches like BDD. But I think, I've realised more and more and more that delivery is about people and teams and groups of human beings. And I think that that's always probably where I sat and what motivated me the most. So I guess I've been doing lots of training recently and had new opportunities and been fortunate enough to sort of go and do whatever I wanted to do. So I recently joined Skills Matter on their senior team and managed to get myself a job title of Head of People Potential, which is pretty cool. So I'm helping the teams at Skills Matter work well together and be happy and effective. And then I get as well independently to keep doing my BDD stuff and training and that kind of thing.
So I know Skills Matter as a London tech journalist, and I would say I know it as basically a location of about half the events I'm interested to go to, since I read about a lot, the convergence of culture and tech. What is Skills Matter with people? And by the way, that's a great title. People, what was it? People...
Head of People Potential.
Potential, that was it. Not possibility.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. So what is exactly Skills Matter to those, especially because a lot of our audience might be European?
So Skills Matter is a community basically of engineers, anybody who's involved in software development. I think we've got close to 150,000 members in Europe now. So we have a physical space called Code Node in London in the city, but we also have lots and lots of remote members who log on to skillsmatter.com to look at all of our free talks and skills casts. So I guess we're a community. We believe in learning and sharing, so we bring together 6 or 7 free meetups every night in our space in London. We also have, I think, nearly 15 of our own conferences that we run each year, and then I think nearly 80 different training courses. So we try and support developers, anybody in a technical career on their journey, but also we want to bring people together to learn and share everything about their passion.
Wow. Okay. And let's talk about BDD.
Okay.
Your talk, you'll be touching upon that. It's a much broader topic than could be in one talk. But first of all, define what BDD is and stands for and how you would describe it.
So BDD stands for Behaviour-Driven Development. Defining it is quite hard actually, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So it was originally coined by Dan North, I think, going all the way back to 2003, I think, in an article that he wrote. And when he came up with it, it's kind of spawned out of automated testing and wanting to make those tests named really well and visible to the rest of the team for them to for them to sort of review and interact with, and basically bringing the business in. And it sort of evolved into something whereby tooling around that concept grew at the time to help business analysts and testers use plain text to actually write tests which ran in the background. So it was quite, when it first came about, it was quite at the sharp end. You know, it was to do with automated testing and being able to give visibility to those automated tests to help with conversations. I think over the years it's evolved a lot to be much more about agile analysis and discovery, much more about using examples to guide conversations. And actually, by specifying a test up front and talking about it with the whole development team, you get to eke out loads and loads of misunderstandings. So for me, I came in more from the kind of business analyst testing end rather than the development end. And so for me, it really means anything to do with collaborating around examples. But if you look up BDD, you'll get very different views from different people depending on whether you're a developer or a tester or a business analyst, or, you know, so it's still a bit of a minefield.
But I guess a simple way is it's about putting into code and into testing ideas that customers want, how customers behave, and then, and your customers could obviously be, if you're an API first product, your developers as well, and mapping it out. And I guess Post-its are heavily involved in BDD, yes? Yeah,
so it's really about making sure, so whilst it's to do with automation, it's really about making sure that the business and the customers are getting what they really need to take their business forward. So there's lots of focus on value and basically bringing in the outside kind of needs right in to make it clear in the tests that you're running at the lower level. So yeah.
And then how does it then fit in with overall testing? How does BDD fit into that piece? And is it only at the very beginning are you using BDD, or across the entire life cycle? Or
so I think, so for me, it's kind of a philosophy, and some of the stuff I talk about is how to use the philosophies around BDD to sort of navigate your way around the whole analysis process, right from the beginning where you have a customer need or a business idea, all the way through to the kind of detailed implementation, because you're dealing with lots of different levels of detail as you kind of unpick and examine user stories. You're dealing with lots and lots of different levels, and it can get quite overwhelming and confusing if you're trying to track all of that on a single Post-it note. So for me, I use the OOPSI approach, which I'm talking about at the conference, which is really about breaking down that analysis process and using different BDD techniques at each layer of that analysis and discovery process. So it depends where you are in the process, what kind of technique you use, if that makes sense.
And then it's about combining certain steps of the user story, right? That are logical, like certain processes or things that I guess could be one pull instead of 3 pulls and things like that.
So I'm not sure I would say it's about combining steps. So I guess what you're trying to do, and what BDD I think helps with, is get to a chunk of value that you can deliver in isolation as quickly as you can. So it's really difficult to chunk down the big boulder into something which is just a set of really lean examples to help you get started. So user stories are quite hard to deal with because they can start off being a really, really high level, and there can be loads of detail in there. And it's only when you examine it, you realise that it's made up of loads and loads and loads of different examples. So when I'm trying to make that process from high level ideas through to kind of detailed BDD tests, it's about finding the smallest possible example of something And that would be using real data. And this is another thing that's really important in BDD, is you want to have conversations about small examples, real business outcomes and outputs using real data. So it's trying to bring those conversations forward.
So can you really do BDD if you're a new product and you don't have users yet, or is BDD something that comes in more once you have a solid user base and more use cases?
No, completely. You can use BDD techniques for any kind of project. I think that the main thing is about how to break down the problem, starting with value. So you can do that. You can do that kind of with a complete greenfield. In fact, it's almost easier when you've got a complete kind of greenfield to use techniques like impact mapping, which is very much associated with BDD, to look at the different options and ideas you have for delivery, and then sort of start to break down your stories and your examples from there. So yeah, absolutely.
So to break it down for people that maybe haven't worked with BDD before, do you want to explain given, when, then for a little bit, and then maybe what impact mapping is, so we can explain it from that level and then dive deeper?
Given, when, then is very much at the sharp end. So, you know, when I was talking earlier about it can mean lots of things to different people. So if you talk about BDD being test automation, using English language to run tests, that's where given, when, then sits. So there's a whole load of people using tools like Cucumber, SpecFlow, loads of others, where you basically arrange a text using the syntax given, when, then. So given would relate to all the preconditions. When is the actual thing that's happening, the action, and then is the output and the expected result. So the given, when, then structure allows a test person or business person to in real language explain a particular behavior, and then it easily be translatable into an automated test using tools which turn that syntax into something which can actually run. So that's very much at the sharp end, kind of right at the end of a whole load of analysis that you might use to actually get something running and automated. So lots of people would say that is BDD. I would say that BDD is also starting right at the beginning of a problem or a project, where you would look at the impacts that you're trying to achieve, spend a lot of time focusing on the goals and how to measure those goals, the different options available to do that. Impact mapping is a really, really simple technique, kind of brought into popularity by Gojko Adjik about 6 or 7 years ago now. And it's a very easy technique where you do a mind map and you explore from a goal, well-defined goal, through actors, stakeholders who might be able to influence that goal, the different impacts and behaviours that you might want to change, and then it's only then that you look at the potential software features or business actions that might actually contribute towards achieving the impact. So really recommend the book Impact Mapping. So that's a way to kind of figure out your scope. It's like a kind of living roadmap. And then I would use techniques that also sit a bit in the BDD space, like story mapping and OOPSI, to then take those impacts and break them down towards lower level examples. And it's only when you've really thought about the different examples and scenarios you want to build that we'd get to using the kind of given, when, then language. That's how I do it. Some people use given, when, then language right from the beginning of a conversation with a user, but it can get, you don't want to use syntax to the extent that you forget all of your other normal ways of communicating as a human being. So it's just one way of helping conversations.
You don't want to predefine the grammatical structure of your conversation until you've had the conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, when I'm consulting and training, sometimes I hear stories about teams who are struggling with given, when, then, and BDD because they've said to their users, okay, go and think about what you need and write everything down in this format.
That's doing the work for you.
Yeah, and they go,
you don't have to then. Oh, that's easy. Why don't you just have them code for you?
Yeah. Or another thing, you know, a tester on their own been sent over to a corner writing their given, when, thens. And you know, when it becomes that kind of arbitrary following of a syntax, then you've lost all of the value of the conversations and the collaborations which it was there to help support. So there's lots of kind of anti-patterns and bad practices by people falling straight, you know, thinking that the effective BDD is all about syntax and automation. And if you start from that point of view, you're missing most of the value, which is about the conversations and the examples.
It's about taking it outside the development team, speaking a language, a common language that everyone understands, including stakeholders or users, your end users, who could be like a Facebook app user who has no idea what language Facebook's built on and doesn't care.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the ubiquitous language. It's also, I mean, the examples for me are really important because it's really like bringing the tests forward. So when I spent a lot of time doing testing and test management and that kind of thing. And it was always when, you know, no matter how good the BAs were and the team were, it was always when it got to the testing team that they would start to throw real data at it. And they'd be like, oh, how do I run this test? How do I figure this out? They'd have to go scrambling around for data, and they'd realise at that point that there were ambiguities in the requirements. And then there'd be inevitable rework. So just by having that conversation before any code is developed to say, what data would you use to run this test and what would that look like, immediately informs the design massively and cuts out loads of those expensive late changes. So for me, that was a real kind of nirvana moment, thinking, oh crikey, why don't we write the tests first instead of really detailed use cases? Why don't we just augment them with some really good examples before we start development? And when we did that, you know, we just transformed our delivery.
Does that mean that it's less likely to break in the final product because you've tested it first and from the beginning you're testing?
Yeah, so it means that you're actually thinking of the, rather than writing requirements in this ambiguous language, you're actually specifying how you want the system to work with real data and tests at the beginning. So naturally, that resolves a lot of problems that would have happened in the testing cycle if you'd left it to the end. So for me, that's where the value of BDD is doing that analysis and that thinking up front, rather than the tooling or the use of the syntax. It's the ability to actually think of a specific example, because examples help us all understand. We do it every day.
Builds user empathy too. Examples bring empathy and connect it from, instead of a product you're creating, it's directly communicating with the user.
Yeah.
And it's just good sales to constantly check if the user likes what you're building.
Yeah. And that's when the language actually can be quite useful. If you think about, so Liz Keogh has this thing called context and outcome questioning, and she says that it's helpful to say, given these preconditions, are there any other outputs or any other expected results that you might think of? And you get the business user thinking, actually, you know, there's this one particular edge case, and then doing it the other way around. So saying, you know, looking at this particular expected result or output, are there any other preconditions or contexts that would lead to that? So that's the kind of exploration and use of examples that you want to kind of embed into your process, rather than everybody working independently on their given when thens. That's something that you definitely don't want to happen.
Interestingly enough, Liz was the keynote speaker at our sister conference, Agile Tour London, this past spring. So that shows something of kinship of agile-minded people, which is great. I was at a conference last week, Monkey Graw, which was just awesome, and it was about accessibility. And that was the general topic. It tends to have a general topic, then let people dive in as they wish. And one of the topics that came up was that HTML is dramatically more accessible than like JavaScript because it's semantic. It makes it very easily translatable to not just different languages and foreign languages, not just coding languages, but also for screen readers and things like that. So I assume logically with the semantic setup of the syntax of BDD, it would also naturally make things more accessible, not just within tech and non-tech people like me who could kind of read these tests. I couldn't perform them, but I could read them because I'd understand given this and that, which doesn't mean you have to build it that way, but you have to think about things in a certain order. So I think that
absolutely, and I think very much that was the intention of it when it was kind of first thought of, was about making the tests more accessible so that the business and other members of the development team could, collaborate better around the tests. Absolutely, I think that's really the core of it, and it's worth remembering because what we don't want is like thousands of these given when then style tests sitting in a tool somewhere that are impossible to navigate. Well, because the intention was that they would be there so that it'd be easy to read, but actually how many business users would go and wade through. So a lot of it is common sense as well, in terms of making sure that if you're going to use automation, it's at the right level of your system, using the right tools to perform the right type of test.
Is that why the Post-its come up? So it's something I identify very intrinsically. Well, you identify it with certain things like Kanban and other agile practices anyway, but with BDD, all the exercises seem to come around Post-its. But is that about taking it out of the code and getting people interacting in a physical space? Or it could also be done virtually. There's many tools that do virtual Post-iting. But is the idea that it gets part of BDD is about behavior, humans, so it's also about changing the behavior of the team to start collaborating more visually?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's all about collaboration. So we know that groups are intelligent. We know that the more diverse groups are, then the better the outcomes that we have, particularly if there's a little bit of conflict in a group. So we want to encourage conversation and discussion around requirements and business needs and impacts and those sorts of things. So just the act of getting people together, and I guess the Post-it notes help you physically interact and reorder things and sort of figure things out, because you've always got this design thinking process happening when you're wrestling with something. You're basically starting off looking at a problem domain and trying to wrestle it into a solution domain. So you do this design thinking whereby you start off looking at options and choices, and then there's loads of collaboration and everybody gets heard, and then you start to synthesize that down to some kind of action or implementation or specification or example or something which becomes a concrete thing. So to facilitate that process of design thinking, you want to get people in a room, and certainly the creating choice is part of it, and there's no wrong answer, so Post-its are really useful for that. What we're less good at is then, particularly in Agile, is then really capturing the converged outcome of that collaboration, where this is the example that we're going to use. So I love BDD for that, because you come out with an example, or you come out with a process flow or an impact map, and that is gonna help the delivery team with the next step.
And it translates to all stakeholders too.
Yeah. but it's not just post-it notes, and this is something that I'm quite passionate about, actually. I think we should do more diagrams. We shouldn't just have post-it notes. We need process flows and swim lane diagrams, and we seem to have lost a lot of process stuff that used to be part of the analysis world.
Is that a reflection of going from waterfall to agile, you think, or?
Yeah, it is, because I think that business analysis and, you know, diagrams and those sort of tools maybe were a bit of a dirty word because they were associated with all of that upfront thinking, you know, all of that detailed upfront work, and people associate that with analysis paralysis.
Analysis paralysis, beautiful, right?
Yeah, well, that's been around for a while. So people associate those diagrams and things with the olden days, and RUP and UML and things like that were very heavyweight. But process flows, process as a thing really helps us understand the context and a journey, and it helps us bring together elements of a UX versus elements that are, you know, services and things like that, and events. So Jeff Patton's story mapping, for example, is a wonderful agile practice where we actually get to look at process. And that's where Oopsie came in, is this, for me, this need to break down a problem into its sort of sequential narrative. So we should be doing more of that. I think the thing with agile is if you've broken things down in the right way, when you're drawing your diagram, it's of a much smaller thing. So you don't get those sort of 9 pieces of printed out paper sellotaped together that you might have got in the olden days. You can just have like a small process, but it's knowing the difficulty, and when you're working with agile, is knowing when to use these different techniques, because it can be confusing. You've got your post-it note and you think, I'm supposed to go have a conversation now.
Which you are. That's the whole point. Yeah. You're supposed to have a conversation with people, not live in your silos.
So what I've been interested in and quite motivated by is how to sort of navigate that journey from having a big problem to solve to having a detailed example to implement. And that's where Oopsie came from, was to help with that.
And who should be typically facilitating these processes?
So I think anybody from the team. I think product owners are really normally well tooled up to do it, but also test analysts, any kind of dev person on the team.
It could be something that could change every time, like a different person does it, so they learn the process. It could be
absolutely.
And how long would an impact mapping, because you do have to time box, especially something like this, because it falls into your bi-weekly sprint, I assume. How long should they be time boxing for?
So this is all part of Oopsie. This gets quite difficult to explain quickly. So impact mapping is something that you would do at the beginning of a horizon, some kind of value horizon. Yeah, so you might not do it every sprint. You could do if you wanted. You can do it in the large and the small, but you'd do that sort of as you were figuring out your options and your roadmap. Mm-hmm. Story mapping is something that you would probably do every when you're looking at maybe a couple of sprints, and it'll help you plan out your iterations. So you could do story mapping as part of a 3-month plan of sprints, or 3 sprints, or something like that. Oopsie mapping is something you would then do every sprint. So that's it's all of these different techniques are sort of helping you break it down, and that's why you would use them at different parts of the life cycle. So you do Oopsie mapping. Example mapping is quite a similar thing that Matt Wynn and Seb Rose came up with. You'd be doing that more at the beginning of a sprint and within the sprint. And then when you're within the sprint and you're looking at smaller capabilities, you'd be using spec by example type 3 Amigo workshops to wrestle it. So all of these things would be are there to solve different problems. I guess an impact mapping session could be an hour, it could be 4 hours. Similar with story mapping, it depends on the lens of stuff you're looking at, how big and complicated it is.
And then with all these user examples, it also ends up translating to great documentation and useful for the end user and things like that.
Yeah, you get the right amount of documentation. You can just take a picture of it, stick it on the wiki, and you're done.
I would not recommend that, as I've learned you want things to be readable by machines because then it's accessible in case you have someone that needs a screen reader. But yes, you can start by that, but do a caption or alt tag in the background.
Yeah.
Something I've always ignored before last week. Thank you so much for taking this time. And I just have to vouch, I have never coded a day in my life, but I've been through one of your OOPSI trainings. And it is something that translates to us Luddites. It's something I could even go through. So there are, of course, agile coaches out there that haven't coded a day in their life, but are there to coach the teams and to coach the communication. And this is an excellent tool for that as well. So it shouldn't be missed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.